MHA Consulting. Just to kind of get through the quick salesy piece, if you're not familiar with MHA, we've been around for just about 20 years. The consultants that we have all have about 20 years, or on average about 20 years of experience. So we've been doing this for a while. Myself, I am an IT individual by trade. I've been a systems administrator, database administrator, and then worked into management around systems integration and liaison between IT and business functions. So kind of have crossed over between those two, and from a MHA perspective, really concentrate on both the business continuity side, but also am the practice leader for the technology side of things. So that's me. Unfortunately, I'm in that 20-year experience range. I tell people all the time the bald head is to prevent people from seeing all the gray hair. So anyway, we do most of our revenue from consulting, and then we do have some SaaS solutions as well. But that's kind of who we are. Again, for those that have just joined, thank you very much. We're just getting started on our mock exercise discussion. This is just kind of some of the companies that we've worked for. This is really just to show that I think we've got a pretty good pedigree, as well as a diverse background of working with different sizes of organizations and across multiple verticals. So that's really helped us as we look at these various, specifically around exercises and what is needed for organizations, but also on the consulting side of the world. Our company in and of itself, we kind of do the entire suite of business continuity services, all the way from assessing the environment to assisting with maintaining a program, and all the way to helping develop documentation, strategies, all of those kind of things. So we can pretty much assist you at any depth or any level that you would like, and we're happy to do so. So what we're really here to talk about is mock disaster exercise. So if you'd like, you can use the chat feature. If you have a question, we'll definitely address those. But for those who are on, since we've only got about 10 or so folks on, is there anything that you would like to make sure is addressed? Any specific questions that you're really concerned about before we kind of get rolling into this? I just want to make sure that I can address those as we go along and answer any of those questions. So if you do have anything, shout it out. If not, I'll just get started. All right. If at any point you do have a question or a comment, a clarification, please feel free to use the chat feature, or if you're on mute, take yourself off mute, and we're happy to answer that. Again, we're I think a small enough group that we can kind of do that and kind of make it a discussion rather than me just sitting here talking through. But happy to do that. So wonderful. Well, just to kind of make sure we're all in the same kind of point as far as what's a mock disaster exercise. Kind of across the board. Really what we're trying to do is simulate some type of crisis or disruption. And we want those who are participating to take steps to successfully respond, assess, and actually recover in an appropriate manner. One of the things, and we'll talk about this from a scenario perspective, that we really, unless it's a very, very new organization, that we don't like to do is we like to make sure that we don't want these things to be completely unrealistic. So when we've met with organizations and they say, we're going to present like it's a zombie apocalypse because that'll be fun. It's like, that's really not reality. So we really want this to be a reality-based simulation so that people can actually do things based on what may happen rather than it being more of a video game or a complete movie type of scenario. So I think that's really the most important thing, really simulating this to help people in a real type of event. So what we kind of want to talk about here is, kind of the methodology and the exercise types. But as you see, a lot of what we're going to be talking about is about the people, the planning, the complexity, training, how do we do appropriate exercises, assessing the results, resolving the findings, and then the various exercise types, right, as we talk through those. And you can see kind of the ones that we have here, all the way from a tabletop to a let's actually fail over and do an actual interruption test for an organization. That's kind of what we want to talk about there. Are there any questions, anything that you want to make sure is addressed? All right. So before we get into all of those specific details, kind of what is leading to this presentation or this webinar today is trends and what we see things and where we see exercises going. One of the things I think is important to note, and some of you are probably the exception here potentially, is the best of class capability, that these exercises either are still very assumption based, they're not as reality based, the execution doesn't occur, or the actual strategies that are being exercised aren't necessarily best in class. And that's one of the things that will help in these exercises. Also, often the exercises are pushed to the side. They're easily canceled. They're not that important because they take people away from other maybe strategic work. And so there isn't an emphasis on both the training and the exercises, because training is just as important as doing the exercises. While the exercises can help with the training part of it, kind of helping people be prepared makes the exercises even a better training and a more effective opportunity. The other thing, and I've heard this from multiple organizations, is there's really no reason to test this or to exercise it because we'll never have to do it. And unfortunately, we all know that just isn't the case. And without preparation, without exercising, without trying, it becomes an ad hoc scenario every single time rather than actually being prepared. And organizations such as healthcare organizations, those tend to be very good at that because they know they have to be able to kind of work on muscle memory, if you will. Right? You don't want to have to think about certain things. You want to just be able to run and execute. The attention spans and the availability is becoming much shorter. And so whether that's because of our time, whether that's because of the change in demographics as we get younger folks who are, have that less attention span, it's hard to sit down and do a 4-hour exercise these days. People just don't have either the time or the attention to do that. And one of the things that we'll talk in is important is incorporating external partners. That's a very, very critical piece and really makes the exercise more viable and a lot more realistic. And then lastly, the folks that are facilitating or leading these really are not the right people, and we'll talk about that. And then as you can kind of see from the next phase, what we're trying to get folks to look at is really making things that your plans and your exercise isn't necessarily scenario agnostic, but it's really about the impacts, focusing on what's going to be happening, not the scenario. So one of the things that we talk about is in an exercise I did one time, we actually spent the first 2 hours discussing why the scenario was not valid, as opposed to actually letting it go. So it is about the impacts and trying to make that work. Also, testing the real-time capability. Often in our exercises, since they are simulated, the first half hour is a day's worth of simulation. We're seeing that actually doing these things in real time can have a lot of value because people see what it really takes, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. And you can see some of these other things. You might want to do some virtual reality exercises. mini full exercises. You do a big one, you might do a couple of small ones. We've done things where we've broken them up over a couple days, just because that was the timing. And then the last thing is in the exercises and in the plans that you have is using more of a checklist approach as opposed to a narrative plan. That can be very helpful. All right. So as we're going through and thinking about these exercises, one of the things that we want to think about is kind of this balance, right? Of our resilience is that balance between risk and readiness and maturity and capability. So we almost want to make sure that we're keeping everything in balance, right? That there's not too much risk on one side, yet we're not overly implemented or have over-architected some of our solutions just because we want to be completely prepared. Part of this goes back to what is the risk of the organization, how much risk are you willing to take, how prepared you want to be. So this balance may be different for different organizations, but in the end, you kind of want to make sure that our resilience is balancing those two things. And that's really where some of the exercises come in. It helps us understand, based on our risks, are we prepared? And will our strategies work? So, from an exercise perspective, I would say, especially as it relates to mock exercises or tabletop exercises, but even those things where we actually do a recovery and are performing either productive functions in an exercise or simulating them, say, like in a technical recovery exercise, in a DR exercise. The human factor is probably that one part that is most variable and can actually have some of the biggest impact. Putting the right people in the right role is absolutely key. And as you see here, title is not the way to do that. It's really fit, capability, and skill set. The organizations that do the best at this, it's not the highest ranking person is leading the team or leading the exercise. It's the person who can facilitate and can ensure that all the voices are being heard is the right lead, because these exercises are not about giving direction and giving orders. It's about making sure that whatever the scenario is and whatever team is being exercised is able to execute their tasks appropriately. As you can see some of these things, it is interesting that the lead is kind of how the personality goes. If it's directive, the team shuts down. If it's open and collaborative, now there's a lot of effective communication, a lot of effective execution. But also be prepared for whether you're a highly political organization, hierarchical, generational, cultural, all of those things need to be addressed. And one of the main factors of doing an exercise is to understand those factors and those issues that come up. Are the right people sitting there? Is there a generational issue with the younger folks coming in who really don't want to be told what to do, or they want to do everything remote and they're not used to being in a room? Those kind of things. You want to keep things as simple and straightforward as possible, even in complex scenarios. That will make the exercise easier. And then coming together and working in a collaborative effort tend to be more successful than just the directive, as I said. And then, as we said, attention spans can be very short, especially if people have their laptops in front of them and they're trying to do their regular job or their responsibilities at the same time as the exercise. So making sure that those distractions are removed can be very, very helpful. So what do we do about planning the exercise? Really, this isn't an exercise planning shouldn't be the week before. It doesn't mean that you need to spend months planning it, but you really do want to take a lot of these things into consideration. So, looking through the considerations, right? You want to make sure that as you mature, your scenarios become increasingly complex. So at the very beginning, it might be, and we'll talk about some scenarios, but it might be something very straightforward. It might just be a single application is going down, or a very straightforward security issue that needs to be addressed. But then over time, you're going to want to make sure that you're bringing in more individuals, more departments, that maybe the scenario is not as obvious as in terms of what actions should be taken. Also, the available time for the exercise. What can you really do? As I said, one of the things that we've done is we've broken these exercises up over a couple days. So we might do two exercises over, or two portions of the exercise over a couple of different days. Got a question that I apologize because I was looking over here that I do want to address since we were talking about it, which was how do you deal with senior managers who want to take over the exercise and not allow others to speak? That's a great question, and I think that comes in, this fits very nicely in the planning of the exercise. If you know that those individuals are there, one of the things is to prepare them ahead of time and either ask them to come in later in the exercise. So go down the planning and say, we want to use secondary resources first so that you can get those folks to participate and have them come in after the fact. Or simulate it in terms of some of the senior managers have to be off with a corporate crisis team, and the team that you're exercising will then give them the results. That's one area. Depending on the political nature, if they're open to it, I've actually sat down with some of those senior folks prior to the exercise and specifically just directly said, we need you not to speak so much. It's surprising that just by doing that and explaining why, we've had some success there. Now, again, that might not be the perfect way to do it, or you might not be able to do that within your organization if that's not their personality or the political nature. But I think, and we found that sometimes just being direct as to what we're trying to accomplish is helpful in that, or just not including them up front as well. Is that helpful, Sean? And if you want to follow up, please go ahead and throw in another chat question. But again, as part of the planning, you can do that, is understanding that the individuals and the nature that's going to be happening, so you can be prepared for that. Sometimes also having that lead who's ready to shut things down, when discussions go too far, can be helpful. As part of the planning, make sure you understand who those resources are, any technology, people, etc. It might be, and it's not just the technology that's required as part of the recovery exercises, but for facilitating the exercise yourself. Are you going to use a PowerPoint such as this? Are you going to need different video? Are you going to need to move people? All of that kind of thing. The video, the phones, the connectivity, all of that you want to kind of prepare up front. I like to say you want to have your exercise logistics very well planned out, but not necessarily the actual event types of things. So you want to be able to exercise it very smoothly, but you don't want to plan it so far as to you've taken over the recovery strategy, and it's now just kind of a checkbox exercise where people aren't working in reality. And then consider the exercise type that we'll talk about shortly, and then the budget. So as you go through all of that, just a planning document is nice to have, right? It has all of these things on it: the purpose, the scope, the objectives, the assumptions, the risk, all of that. It doesn't have to be a 15-page document. It can be a 2-pager, but just so that you know you've addressed all those things. And if you look at the Department of Homeland Security, they've got a really nice generic template that you could leverage. So, what type of exercise do you need to do? One of the key pieces is, what is the maturity of the team? How far along are you? Now, you could have a very mature business continuity program, but you may be dealing with people or departments who really are new to this. And so that may be where you have to look at it and say, we need to just do a tabletop so that they get familiar with the concepts that we're going through. And when we think tabletop, often we think of just mock crisis exercises where we're doing emergency management. But these tabletop exercises could also be on the technical side, where people just go through their actual business recovery plan or their technical recovery plan and just work through the steps and simulate that they've moved here, they've gotten this laptop working, or they've recovered these applications and the steps that they would go through. It then helps them to, one, understand that, but also identify maybe where there are some major gaps. Again, and that goes back to the objectives. Is the objective to demonstrate a technical capability? Is the objective to train people? What really do you want to do there? And then, as we said, work on adding some complexity over time. It doesn't have to be a big jump, but it can be small steps all along the way. And it's definitely okay to look and do multiple tabletops with groups, right? Those could be the mini ones that you do before a large actual recovery type exercise where you're moving people or you're doing some actual execution. You might do a couple of those ahead of what your main annual exercise might be. Sometimes you have to may go back and say, you know what, we had some real issues with this big exercise with multiple departments. We've got to step back and do this departmental. I'm actually in the middle of an exercise this week on the technical side, and we found some significant technology challenges. We're actually going to go back and look at just some very specific technologies and what needs to be done with those and exercise those before we do another larger exercise. So we're having to do this at a client that is active at this moment. And then I think the biggest thing about exercises is really helping them understand and be able to build capability and understand true capacity and capability. It's not necessarily to get people to fail. Now, that being said, the complexity needs to be such that people and processes are stretched. Because one of the other things that you want for the exercise is, where are your gaps? What may not work? If every exercise you turn around and say there were no issues, then the scope of the exercise and the scenario was probably not sufficient. One of the things I do like to say is we're planning exercises and planning scope is, if in an exercise there are no issues, one of two things have happened. Either the scope was so small or the scenario was so small that it really didn't exercise anyone, or people were not forthcoming with what the issues really were. It's kind of like real exercising, right? If you're a marathon runner and you decide that all you're going to go do is go out and run a mile at a slow pace, that's not exercising. That's just a walk in the park for you. So we need to make sure that the type of exercise and what we do is big enough that it does stretch folks. But the goal is not to make it a failure in the sense of it completely falls apart. So as we talk through the types of exercises, so you can see here, you're probably all familiar with these. We've got kind of the structured tabletop exercise, right? This is something that can be done in a day. It can be done with a lot of low risk, right? There really isn't anything to do. It's just a conference room. This can be really helpful for really people who are not familiar with the processes, but also can be a really good reinforcement exercise for folks if something hasn't been done for a while or they haven't been able to participate. Then we actually want to do more of just a simulated test. This could be the standard crisis where you have a scenario that you work through. When you're walking through your plan, you're actually doing some executable tasks. You may be writing communications. You actually may go through and move some people to different rooms to simulate moving from your work location and logging on to laptops, things like that. Again, pretty low risk, and you can do this over multiple days. Then you kind of have the functional drill where you're really performing your test either in a simulated way or in a partial production move. So you actually may move a department from their primary work location to their alternate site. This fits in with technology, right, where we recover applications in the DR environment and test that out. Bring folks in and have them test those applications, things like that. The risk can be a little bit higher because now you're potentially impacting production activities. So the planning for that, you want to do a lot more to make sure that the exercise doesn't really impact production. And then you have, and those are probably, between the walkthrough simulations and the functional drills, those are probably the ones we think most of in terms of the exercises that we do regularly, as opposed to the tabletops. That's what we see most organizations doing. Very few organizations are doing the last, which is the full interruption or full-scale test, where you say, we're moving an entire building to the alternate location to work, or we're actually going to fail over applications and run at the alternate site productively. That takes a tremendous amount. That really is potentially months of planning. That's not something you do in the first year or two of your program, because you will have had to have gone through all of these other exercises numerous times to make sure all of the major issues have been resolved and people know their roles, their skill set is there, they can execute this recovery seamlessly, as seamless as possible. Again, because you really don't want to interrupt production activities for an exercise, if you can help it. We have had organizations where we've planned these, where we're sitting there as people are coming into the office and we're saying, the building is unavailable, you need to go execute your relocation plan, and which was work at home. Please go home and start working from home. All of the environments were ready to go, and they were able to do that successfully. But that took several years of other tests before they were able to get there. But it's a great thing to be able to demonstrate to your organization. Any questions? All right. So the increasingly complex exercises. So what you can kind of see here is this may be recovering a system or just a department, right? Then we start looking at, now that we can do that, we start integrating those, right? Multiple systems, multiple departments, maybe upstream and downstream dependencies, right? The business processes will move back and forth, right, as we go through and make sure from a business continuity perspective, those can be done. Or if it's an emergency management type of exercise, that the various emergency management groups, there might be an IT emergency management team that's dealing with all the IT issues while this is going on, and you have your corporate crisis team that's happening, and maybe there's departmental crisis team. Those are now being coordinated, and the exercise is using all of them together, potentially in different places because that's where they would be, and then you'd be coming back into the appropriate places to give updates, right? So adding that, also increasing this so that there's more real time. One of the things that we did kind of from an increased complexity perspective, the scenario itself was pretty straightforward, and it was a shorter, there were fewer number of injects or additions to the scenario, but we actually had people execute their plan. So for example, this was the one that we most recently did, was an IT emergency exercise. We weren't recovering systems, but we were exercising their emergency management function. And at part of the way through, the building that they were located in, which was their normal assembly point, the building had to be evacuated as part of the scenario. So we said, go ahead and evacuate. Well, they were all used to simulating it and saying, okay, we've evacuated, we're now going to pick up. And the leader said, no, we're evacuating the building, go to our secondary site, which was across town. This took about, by the time people got to the facility, it took about 20 minutes to 30 minutes to drive there. And then, interestingly enough, it took about another 30 minutes for people to actually find the room in which they were supposed to be in, get situated, get logged back in. So it was a good hour before people were functioning again. That was a really big learning. All of a sudden, people realized, oh my gosh, we were out of pocket for an hour. Here are all the things that could have happened in that hour. So doing that real-time, more complex scenario was very insightful. Also, multiple exercises, right? And using multiple types, kind of as we talked about previously, right? The single large integration exercises versus limited scope, departmental, tabletop are really good for changes, and then integrating everything together. We've kind of talked through this already. Are there any other, I just want to pause there for a moment and see if there are any questions as it relates to the content up to now. So, developing your scenario, this is kind of where we're saying we want these scenarios to be somewhat agnostic, or your processing to be agnostic, but the scenario can be helpful to elicit what you're trying to execute. Are you trying to work on collaboration? Then your scenario might want to be about that. You want to exercise the actual recovery strategies to see if there are any gaps. Then your scenario might deal with that. But it's really about getting folks to be able to grow, ensure that the recovery and the plans that you have make sense for your organization, that they're just not a generic solution that somebody pulled off the internet and said, oh, it'll work for that company, it'll work for us. Because all of the execution is different. The political nature is, as the question was ahead of time, what about our senior management who want to kind of take control? So the scenario could help drive that to where all of a sudden, senior management has to leave the room because they have to go do something else while the rest of the group is working. That might be, something to consider in the scenario. Make sure that the scenario is as realistic as possible, but it doesn't necessarily have to be overly complex. And so you might have to bring some folks into your discussion and make sure that it's somewhat confidential so that they can help you with the scenario. For example, if you're going to have some technology-related issues, bring the IT folks in, or a couple of IT folks, to say, this is what we're trying to accomplish. How do we make sure the scenario is reality for our organization? That's really helpful. And then it makes it more real. Especially, and I can give you an example of one that we made very real, and it was interesting because it was a active shooter event. And what happened, the way the person got in was they got through a fenced area, and then they were able to knock out a person who was sitting out on a break, got into the building, and then were able to, with a badge, and was able to then go through and do the scenario. Well, when the folks first started, they're like, well, that's impossible. Nobody can get into the fence. Well, it turned out at the time, the fence that they got into, the gate would not close automatically, and it would stay open. So you physically had to shut the gate, and it was a gate that led to a public thoroughfare. Well, so that was a very realistic, and all of a sudden when that came up, it really drove the adrenaline of folks understanding this could really happen. And then interestingly enough, the next week that fence was fixed so that it closed automatically every single time. But those are the kind of things that can really make this scenario real, as opposed to just, a made-up zombie apocalypse type of thing. And then, as we said, we really want to make sure that this is something that really could occur in your organization, and that's really where that planning helps. Also, just as a reminder, because of attention spans, and people do need to be able to get work done, you might need to take a break, pause, say, okay, we got 30 minutes, go check your email, go do this so that you can have your attention. That also can help, as opposed to sitting there. Because again, you want to simulate reality. People are going to have to take a break. They're going to have to make personal phone calls, especially if there's a greater community, or there's a potential, like an active shooter. People are going to want to make sure that their families are okay, or they're being taken care of. So try to keep that involved as well. So again, going through all of that, now building it through, determine what is it going to be? Is your overall scenario going to be a man-made issue or a natural disaster or just technological? If it is, then you still may be using technology impacts or other impacts, but you kind of know what this is going to be, and then you can start building the more detail around it, right? So you have your summary. Make sure that's going to align to whatever objectives you're looking at. Is that going to help bring us together as a team, or is that just going to drive, we really want to focus on how the technology and how a recovery strategy would be. And then think about the injects and the reality time it would take to perform certain tasks. So if you're going to have a natural disaster or a fire, if you turn around and say, 30 minutes later, we have X, Y, and Z, when in reality, by the time the fire happens, people get out the door, the first responders are coming, that may be where you want to pull your first responders in and say, in reality, how long would it take before we could get information from you, right? And they can give you that so that it's more reality-based in those injects. And, what information are you going to be able to provide? So, for example, in things like where we have first responders, we've got, I've got a couple of resources who are police officers, firefighters, and all of that, and I'll go use them and say, here's the scenario I'm coming up with. What would you do in reality? And a good example of that was we, again, had a first responder, and we had in there that the management team would be interacting with them. Well, when I spoke to him, he said, I go find the first person that I can find, and I say, I'm in charge. I need you to do X, Y, and Z. And I don't really care what the title of the person is. So it was an interesting discussion because he said, now, if, the vice president or the president of the company came down, yes, I would talk to him. But when I immediately get there, my job is to secure the area, make sure everybody's safe, and I don't care who you are. And so that really helped us develop a scenario to where we were able to say, so again, in the example of senior management trying to take kind of control of the exercise, was able to make the point, you're really not in charge when first responders come. First responders are in charge. So you can't continue to try to drive the situation until they've determined that everything's safe, as an example. Again, those injects, you may only have 1 or 2 injects for the entire exercise because you need that time to execute. Or if you do have to talk, you don't want to limit it. So it's really about the quality and not just the number. Make sure that you kind of understand what you expect the actions to be taken, but also be aware that you might want to be able to do the choose your own ending type of scenario where you may have a couple of injects ready depending on what the decision points are by the group. So that if somebody says, we're moving to our alternate location at the first inject, and the rest of your injects were based on not moving, then your exercise has fallen apart. Whereas if your inject has that capability to then go down this other path, it will help. And as we said, consider doing it in real time if you can. And even if you can't do the whole thing in real time, do certain portions of it. When somebody, when it says on there, create a communication for the employees, have them create the communication. See how long it really takes, as opposed to simulating it and saying, okay, communication done, that was 3 minutes. People have in their head it'll only take 5. The next thing you know, writing it takes 15. Getting it to the person that approves it in wordsmiths, it takes another 15. And all of a sudden, that 5-minute communication has taken 30 minutes. I'm really a big fan of the real-time things built in this scenario. Now, from a facilitation perspective, there's 2 sides to an exercise. One is who's helping facilitate the exercise, and then who might be the lead or the individual for the leading the team. And this may be something else that might help in the senior management taking over type of scenario. So when we go in, if we're facilitating an exercise, we're not the leaders of the exercise. We're just facilitating the exercise to make sure that the exercise is moving forward. It's not getting off track. And so we will kick off the scenario, but then let the team do their work. And then often, if it's working well, we'll just go to the next inject. If it's not, that's where we may pull the leader of the team that is being exercised aside and say, hey, you ought to do this, or we're kind of getting off track here, rather than stepping in and doing it. So having that facilitator, third party, may be a help if the group either is inexperienced or there are individuals who try to take over, because then the facilitator can step in, kind of shut things down, and maybe direct things to the right direction. If it's a real complex exercise, you may need to have multiple facilitators that are on the phone. We've done this where in one we had our crisis team doing an exercise, and we had the IT team. So we had one of us with the crisis team, I was sitting with the IT team, we were going through our pieces, and then we were then communicating back and making sure that different locations were being able to perform their functions appropriately. And the facilitator can also help, drive some decisions and then adjust the exercise as needed. Maybe it's like, you know what, we're going to take a little bit more time because you need more discussion period here, or yeah, let's shut it down. We're going to move on to the next inject or the next scenario. The facilitator is really key. If this is one area where you can try to get somebody who is not one who wants to lead everything, they really want to be one that gets people involved. If the facilitator is doing all of the work, you haven't exercised anything. So something to consider there. So if it's internal, you may want to pull somebody from a completely different area to be the facilitator if they're good at facilitating meetings. Because this person doesn't need to be the expert in the field. They just need to be good at making sure that the process is being followed. And then they're going to want to know the scenario. Any questions or thoughts on facilitation? So we're just about finished here, and then I'm going to go through just a couple of other slides. You really want to go through and make it as fun as possible, but it's not a party, right? We want people to be relaxed, but we also want them to feel a little bit of angst as part of this, so that there's a little bit of adrenaline kicking in, so that they realize this is real. Try to start and be prepared to add and delete things. You might have to give input, but also don't be afraid to stop and say, hey, we need to go back to this, or let's go consider what we just did. And then, as we said, breaks shouldn't be long unless you're planning for them. If you know that we're going to take a half-hour break halfway through because we know people have to go check email, that's fine, but prepare that in your scenario. And then make sure that you're focusing on issues in the exercise. What went well? What didn't? What are we trying to accomplish? Not just we were able to check it off and we did great. Identify where the gaps or what the improvements need to be. And at the end, make sure that you do a quick debrief. We would always recommend that you do a quick debrief at the end, but you may then want to come back the next day and have a secondary debrief after people have had an opportunity to consider and ponder on what's happened. You might have some other good ideas. But if you've done your preparation up front, the exercise point or the exercise execution should go pretty smoothly, as long as you have that appropriate facilitator, you've got the plan, and you've got your scenario kind of built. If the scenario is kind of very rough and not well defined, then you're kind of having to make things up on the fly, and you want to do as few of that as possible. Then in the end, document everything. The big thing is you'll have your exercise document from what you plan, and then you want to include what are your action items, what came out of it, who's responsible, what are the due dates, and then include that in your business continuity action items so that you can get those things fixed. As well as, again, if you look at the Homeland Security planning guides, it has some good resources there. You can do this on anything, a spreadsheet, Word document, whatever it is, as long as you've had somebody keep track of those items. And that should be part of your team. There should be a logistics person or a scribe or an admin function that's doing all of that as part of your exercise. Make sure you also don't just look at the things that went wrong, but also the things that were successful and what went well, especially in those where maybe it was a little rough. Looking at the positives, as we know, is always a helpful thing. Plus, there probably were some good things. There might have been certain individuals who have really stepped up. Those are good things to look at. So now I think one of the benefits of doing this is not only the training of people, but also now you're able to adjust your strategy, understand what people need to be, what training individuals need to have, adjusting your documentation, any kind of coordination amongst groups, but also there may be some help from a budgetary perspective. You actually start seeing, actual results to say, we need to spend some dollars in our BC program around our relocation strategy, or some of our communication technologies are not sufficient. We're just planning on using texting. That's not working. We need to get more of a emergency notification system in, something like that. And that will then help you put your budget together. So leveraging all of those things, it's more than just it works, it doesn't work, people are good, they aren't. It really can help you determine actions within your business continuity or technology recovery departments as well. So just as a overall view of what we want to do here is, these are the most important things. And in all of your planning and in your execution in your plans, this is what we would consider, right? Make sure we've got people safe. Have we stabilized the incident? Are we, the quick response? Then you can look at, preserving assets and then restoration of your functions. And these can be potentially done in parallel, but this is really the priority that you want to be looking at. And this helps in your exercise if you're helping facilitate, or the lead is really focusing on these things first to help people looking at it. If the first thought is, what do I do to get my system up? Or what do I do to make sure my building isn't falling down? Really the first question is everybody safe? And then what do we do from there? This is where when we're facilitating, we're making sure that people are looking through these initially. This is something that'll be in the presentation and you can look at. It's just a technique on how you go through and perform your crisis management, is this API solution. It's really just a very nice methodology and disciplined way to think, from assessing to plan to implementing an evaluation, so that you just go through step by step and look at it. There's a multitude of these. We like this one because it's easy and it's only 4 steps. Are there any questions up to now? I did want to take just a couple minutes before we end and show you a couple of scenarios that we've put together that might help jog your memories. But are there any other questions, thoughts, things I can answer for you before we do that? Okay, so just a quick scenario. This is a school district, and each school clearly has an emergency response. These are kind of the assumptions and what we would make sure the group or the exercise participants would understand if they were new. But this is kind of the scenario that they have. There isn't a notification system, and there are resource officers available at the school. So then the scenario comes up, right? A tanker truck carrying a hazardous chemical was diverted off the freeway to local roads due to an accident. Was making a turn, crashed, and there's a car under the tanker truck. They're on the scene. A hazmat team has come, but they're 30 minutes away. Fire advises that there are schools downwind within 2 miles of the scene, and there's about 500 students, but there is no leak at this time. But the school has been notified. So that's where you would start, right? So, this is very well just maybe one for crisis management and seeing how people react to a very limited amount of information. There's nothing necessarily in danger, but there's a risk. So what would you do? It would be interesting to see how people react to that. The second one would be a payment company, right? Now, this one has more of a protest around it, right? And it's not necessarily your company that's being impacted. It's somebody else in the building. So this is more of a building issue. What are you going to do? So you can kind of see here, right? They've got past security, so there might be a security issue with your facility. the police are coming in, the protesters are inside the building. What are you now going to do to protect your organization? And then one other one is a retail company, a large organization, 500 locations, relatively new to business continuity, can work at home, data centers are in a colo, and their primary call center. So this is one where all of a sudden their POS system is having problems. They're troubleshooting, but they don't know what the problem is. So they've escalated it, and based on that, the IT team has escalated it to the crisis management team, or in this case, what they call an oversight committee. So now it's a technology-based issue, but it's also the technology team is working on it, but what are the business areas going to do? How are they going to be reacting to not having a POS system and all of the resultant downstream impacts? So this one would be more of a coordinating business functions and how they would deal with a major system being down. So with that, I've got a question. We mentioned kind of a virtual reality exercise. What could that be? So this one is, what we would include there is you could actually get some video, and you could actually bring actors in to participate as part of this. Think in terms of, and this isn't done quite as much anymore, but if you kind of mix the simulated news feeds and actually have somebody come in and execute the part. So for example, at one organization we had, I played the actor. I actually walked in, told security that I was in possession of sensitive data and I wanted to talk to somebody. Nobody knew that was happening. The only person that knew was the one person who had worked with us to develop the scenario. The security guard didn't know. The person who was brought up didn't know. So it was kind of that virtual reality, not thinking so much about VR, putting goggles on, but really making that scenario real. And it was an interesting conversation because I gave him my name, I gave him everything. I was who I was, and you could see their eyes going, "How did you get this information?" And so it was quite interesting. So that's kind of what we're talking about in terms of virtual reality. Make it very, very real by using actors or news feeds that can kind of come in rather than just PowerPoints and words. So last things is getting the right people doing the right role. That's key, and that's really part of your assignment of roles, but also making sure you got the right facilitators, etc. Increasing in complex exercises. Think in terms of checklists. It's not about the quantity, it's about the quality, and it doesn't have to be perfect. So kind of the last thing, as it kind of comes down to the exercises, there is a need to let people know that they do have to suspend some of their reality. There may be something that isn't perfect, or they think this will never happen. Well, let's not argue about that, just at least go for it. As long as the scenario is pretty close and you've done your due diligence, there shouldn't be much of that. But there might be a good reminder to say, you know what, you'll watch an action movie and you'll suspend your reality. At least suspend enough of this so that we can get through what we are trying to accomplish and meet the goals of the exercise. And again, focus on the outcome, not just executing, right? You want to be able to actually demonstrate that you're able to recover, and that's what these are intended to do. Are there any questions? If not, I would thank you for your time. You will. This is being recorded, so you'll be able to pull it. You'll receive an email with a link to the presentation, the recording, and you have the contact information there. If you would like to have a further conversation around anything related to this, as it relates to political issues, people issues, I'll be happy to talk to you about your specific case, maybe give you some ideas. on how to deal with that, because some of those are really difficult. And unfortunately, in some cases, it's almost impossible to fix. But we do the best we can with different techniques. So, if there isn't anything else, again, I thank you. I hope you have a good rest of the day, and please reach out at any point, and would love to talk to you.